You're imagining things, Dimitri. It's just the stress from the startup and the visa application talking, Fiora said, her voice dripping with that perfect, practiced patience. She reached across the kitchen island, her cool fingers resting over his. In the dim light of their Kreuzberg apartment, she looked like the supportive, flawless wife. But Dimitri could smell it, the faint, expensive trace of sandalwood and amber. It wasn't Fiora's perfume. It was Yusolt's, their brilliant, sophisticated immigration lawyer. Fiora smiled, a gentle, gaslighting curve of her lips, while her phone buzzed face down on the marble counter. A notification she would later claim was just a legal update. Dimitri didn't pull his hand away. He just smiled back, letting her believe she had won, letting her believe he was losing his mind. Because in the game of betrayal, the one who panics loses. And Dimitri, a mechanical engineer who spent his life understanding how things break, was about to dismantle her life piece by piece. If stories of dark secrets, psychological warfare, and the ultimate price of betrayal speak to your soul, stay with me. This is going to be a cold ride. The espresso machine on the kitchen counter hummed, a low, mechanical vibration that seemed to match the tension coiled at the base of Dimitri's neck. Outside their floor-to-ceiling windows, the Berlin skyline was a canvas of slate gray, the television tower piercing the low-hanging winter clouds. Dimitri stared at the dark liquid dripping into the porcelain cup. He was a mechanical engineer. His entire life was built on the premise that things made sense. Action and reaction, cause and effect. If a machine was vibrating out of rhythm, there was a misaligned gear. If a structure was failing, there was a stress fracture. But marriages didn't come with diagnostic manuals. You barely slept again. Fiora's voice drifted into the kitchen, soft and melodic. Dimitri turned. She stood in the doorway, wearing one of his oversized dress shirts, her dark hair artfully messy. She looked like a UX designer's dream of domestic tranquility, effortlessly aesthetic, perfectly composed. I was thinking about the Series A pitch, Dimitri lied, though it was a half-truth. The startup was draining him, but it wasn't what kept him staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. Dima, you have to stop doing this to yourself, Fiora said, crossing the hardwood floor. She wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. The tech is solid. The investors love it. And Yusolt is handling the visa paperwork. We are so close to being done with the bureaucracy. There it was. The name. Yusolt. Dimitri felt a microscopic tightening in his jaw. Speaking of Yusolt, he kept his voice painstakingly casual. Did she really need you at her office until midnight yesterday? I thought the incorporation documents were finalized. Fiora sighed, a delicate, exasperated sound. She stepped back, breaking the physical contact. When Dimitri turned to face her, her expression had shifted from affectionate to concerned. It was a look he had come to dread, the look of a woman dealing with a fragile, paranoid child. Dimitri, we've talked about this, Fiora said, crossing her arms. The German immigration office requires an exhaustive amount of documentation for spousal business dependencies. Yusolt and I were combing through 5 years of our joint financials so your founder visa doesn't get rejected. She's working overtime for us. I know, Dimitri said, his voice tight. It's just, you two spend a lot of time together lately. Privately. Fiora's eyes softened, brimming with a perfectly calibrated mix of pity and frustration. She reached out, cupping his face. Her fingers were cool. Dima, look at me. You are exhausted. You are projecting your anxiety about the company onto our marriage. You're imagining things, Dimitri. It's just the stress from the startup and the visa application talking. Dimitri looked into her eyes. They were wide, clear, and seemingly honest. For a second, he almost believed her. He almost let himself fall back into the comforting illusion that he was just a stressed-out founder losing his grip on reality. But then, she leaned in to kiss his cheek. As her neck brushed past his face, the scent hit him. It wasn't Fiora's usual floral perfume. It was heavy, woody, and unmistakably distinct. Sandalwood, amber, and a faint trace of expensive tobacco. It was the exact scent that lingered in Yusolt's sleek, Minimalist law office in Myth. Dmitri didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He simply closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, recalibrating his entire reality. The machine wasn't broken, it was sabotaged. "You're right," Dmitri whispered, opening his eyes and offering her a tired, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, Fiora. I'm just losing my mind a little bit with this pitch." Fiora smiled back, a triumphant glint flashing in her eyes before it was quickly masked by spousal warmth. "I know, baby. Just a few more weeks, and we'll have everything we ever wanted." She turned and walked toward the bedroom to get dressed. Dmitri stood alone in the kitchen, the espresso turning cold. He wiped his cheek where she had kissed him. He wasn't losing his mind. He was just finally waking up. And Fiora had no idea what a mechanical engineer could do when he decided to take a system apart. At 2 a.m., the Kreuzberg apartment was a tomb of silence, broken only by the rhythmic, oblivious breathing of Fiora from the master bedroom. Dmitri sat in the dark of his home office, the pale blue glow of his dual monitors washing over his face. He had always been a man of mechanics, someone who believed that every complex system left a trail of data. Fiora was a brilliant UX designer. She understood how to make interfaces look beautiful, how to hide the ugly wiring behind sleek, minimalist buttons. But Dmitri built the wiring. He accessed the administrative logs of their home router. It was a mundane task, something he usually did to optimize their bandwidth for investor video calls. Tonight, however, he was looking for fractures in the foundation. He filtered the traffic by MAC address, isolating Fiora's phone and personal laptop. For the past 3 months, the data showed a strange anomaly. Between midnight and 3 a.m., hours when Fiora claimed to be deeply asleep, massive encrypted data packets were being routed to a private server host based in Switzerland. Dimitri's fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard. He didn't feel rage, not yet. He felt a cold, clinical detachment. He ran a packet sniffer, tracing the handshake protocols. He couldn't read the encrypted messages, but he didn't need to. He recognized the IP architecture. It was the same secure client portal Usult's law firm used for high-net-worth individuals. With quiet precision, Dmitri pulled up Fiora's synced cloud drive. She was careless in her arrogance, assuming her husband was too consumed by his hardware schematics to notice her digital footprint. She had hidden a partition under a dummy directory labeled Berlin_UI_assets_2024. The password was painfully predictable, the date of their wedding anniversary, slightly modified. A sick joke hidden in plain sight. The folder decrypted. Dmitri clicked it open. There were no screaming matches, no shattered glass, just the quiet, devastating click of a mouse as Dimitri's marriage officially died on a backlit screen. The first subfolder contained photos. He didn't linger on them, though the thumbnails burned into his retinas. Fiora and Usult at a secluded cabin in the Black Forest. Fiora wearing Usult's silk robe. A selfie of them holding glasses of champagne in Usult's bed. The timestamp on that particular photo caught his eye, October 14th. The anniversary of Dimitri's father's passing. A night Fiora had sworn she was locked in the studio, finishing a sprint, too busy to come home and comfort him. But the physical betrayal was only the prologue. The true horror lay in the second subfolder, labeled Project Nova. Dmitri opened a PDF document. It was a draft drafted by Usult, written in flawless, impenetrable German legalese, complete with English translations in the margins for Fiora. It was an addendum to the startup's operating agreement, designed to be slipped into the massive stack of series of funding paperwork. He read the highlighted text, his blood turning to ice. Clause 4b. In the event of marital dissolution post-series of funding, all intellectual property rights and voting shares shall default to the co-founder, Fiora, to ensure operational stability. The primary founder, Dmitri, shall be reassigned to a non-executive advisory role, resulting in the revocation of his primary employment sponsorship. They weren't just having an affair. They were engineering a corporate coup. Fiora was using his genius to build the company, and Usult was using her legal expertise to build the trap. Once the investors poured the millions in and the permanent visas were stamped, they would trigger the clause. Dmitri would be fired from his own company, stripped of his equity, and deported back to his home country, leaving them wealthy and secure in Europe. Dmitri leaned back in his ergonomic chair. He looked toward the hallway, where the faint sound of Fiora shifting under the expensive linen sheets echoed softly. She had held him just hours ago, looking into his eyes, telling him he was imagining things. A lesser man would have stormed into the bedroom. A lesser man would have demanded answers, let his emotions dictate his actions, and played right into the hands of a ruthless lawyer. But Dmitri was an engineer. And engineers knew that when you discover a bomb, you don't scream at it. You study the wiring, you find the detonator, and you quietly, methodically, build a bigger explosion of your own. He closed the folders, cleared his access logs, and turned off the monitors. The darkness returned to the room, but Dmitri had never seen things so clearly. The ambient lighting at Käfer, the rooftop restaurant perched atop the Reichstag, was designed to make everyone look powerful and slightly dangerous. Dmitri sat across from Fiora and Yusult, the panoramic view of a glittering, nighttime Berlin serving as the backdrop to the most excruciating meal of his life. Fiora wore a sleek, midnight blue dress that exposed her collarbones, the very collarbones Dmitri had seen Yusult kissing in the hidden digital folder just 48 hours prior. Yusult, in stark contrast, wore a tailored, slate-gray suit that screamed expensive European tailoring. She had the sharp, assessing eyes of a raptor and the smooth, practiced smile of a woman who destroyed lives for a living. "I must say, Dmitri," Yusult murmured, swirling a glass of austere Riesling, her voice a low, cultured purr. "The term sheets from the venture capital firm are practically flawless. Your mechanical prototypes have them salivating. You are on the verge of something extraordinary." Dmitri offered a perfectly calibrated, self-deprecating smile. He reached under the heavy linen tablecloth and placed his hand over Fiora's. She didn't flinch, but he felt the microscopic tightening of her muscles before she relaxed into his touch, turning to beam at Yusult. "We couldn't have navigated the German incorporation laws without you, Yusult," Fiora said, her voice laced with an admiration that Dmitri now knew was not merely professional. "Dima is brilliant with the hardware, but he gets so overwhelmed by the paperwork. You've been our savior." Dmitri watched the subtle exchange. The way Yusult's eyes lingered a fraction of a second too long on Fiora's lips before flicking back to him. The invisible, electric current running beneath the table that excluded him entirely. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, and for the first time, Dmitri was a conscious observer rather than an unwitting victim. "It's true," Dmitri agreed, his voice steady, projecting the earnest gratitude of an exhausted founder. He picked up his fork, slicing into a piece of venison. "The bureaucracy here is a labyrinth. I'm just a guy who builds engines. Without Fiora handling the UX and you handling the legal structure, I'd probably be deported by now." He said the word deported deliberately, watching their reactions. Fiora let out a soft, dismissive laugh, squeezing his hand. "Don't be dramatic, Dima. That's exactly why we have Yusult. To make sure we're both protected." Yusult leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table, her gaze locking onto Dmitri's. There was a cold, clinical curiosity in her eyes. "Indeed. The structure we are finalizing this week ensures that the intellectual property is securely bound to the corporate entity. It protects the company from any unforeseen personal liabilities or structural changes." Clause 4b, Dmitri thought, the alphanumeric designation flashing in his mind like a warning light. She was testing him. She was probing to see if he had read the fine print she had buried on page 87 of the draft agreement. "I trust you completely," Dmitri said, meeting her gaze with wide, trusting eyes. He took a sip of water, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to be comfortable. "I haven't even looked at the latest drafts, honestly. I've been down in the lab running stress tests on the new rotor casing. Whatever you and Fiora think is best for the long-term stability of the company, I'll sign." Fiora visibly relaxed, a subtle exhale escaping her lips as she took a sip of her wine. Yusult's smile widened, a triumphant smirk disguised as professional satisfaction. They believed him. They believed he was exactly what they needed him to be, a brilliant, naive workhorse, completely blind to the slaughterhouse he was being led into. Excellent, Yusult said, raising her glass in a toast. To a successful Series A, and to the future. May it be exactly what we all deserve. Fiora raised her glass, her eyes meeting Yusult's in a silent, shared victory. To the future. Dimitri clinked his glass against theirs, the crystal chiming clearly in the sophisticated din of the restaurant. To getting exactly what we deserve, he echoed, taking a slow, measured sip. As the dinner progressed, Dimitri played his part flawlessly. He engaged in light banter, he paid the exorbitant bill, and he helped Fiora into her coat while Yusult watched from a discreet distance. He was the perfect, oblivious husband. But beneath the surface, the engineer was already drafting the blueprints for a catastrophic system failure. The gears were turning, and Fiora and Yusult had no idea they were standing on the fault line. The rain in Berlin that morning was a relentless, icy drizzle that soaked through Dimitri's wool coat by the time he reached the unmarked building in Charlottenburg. He bypassed the sleek glass elevators of the main corporate firms, opting for a dimly lit stairwell that smelled faintly of old paper and stale coffee. He wasn't here to see a polished, high-profile lawyer like Yusult. He needed someone who understood the dark, intricate mechanics of intellectual property law, someone who specialized in hostile corporate defense and had a visceral distaste for the pristine arrogance of firms like Yusult's. He knocked twice on a frosted glass door bearing the modest brass plaque, Herr Lucas Weber, Rechtsanwalt. Weber was a man who looked like he had survived on nicotine and legal precedents for the last 30 years. He sat behind a desk buried in towering stacks of case files, peering over wire-rimmed glasses as Dimitri entered. "Mr. Volkov," Weber rasped, motioning to a worn leather chair. "You are the founder everyone in the MIT tech bubble is whispering about. The man with the revolutionary magnetic rotor design. Why are you sneaking into my office like a fugitive when you have Yusult von Berg handling your Series A?" Dimitri sat down, placing his damp briefcase on the floor. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He was an engineer. He dealt in schematics and facts. "Because Yusult von Berg is currently restructuring my operating agreement to strip me of my intellectual property and my visa sponsorship the moment the ink dries on the venture capital," Dimitri stated, his voice flat, devoid of the emotional wreckage he had been navigating for days. "And my wife is helping her do it." Weber paused, a lit cigarette hovering halfway to his mouth. He slowly lowered it to an overflowing ashtray, his eyes narrowing with sudden, predatory interest. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered the clinical assessment of a mechanic looking at a beautifully engineered bomb. "I see," Weber said, leaning back. A classic founder squeeze, executed with the intimacy of a marital betrayal. Yusult is ruthless. If she drafted the IP assignment clauses, they are likely ironclad within the German jurisdiction. How much time until the final signing? 3 weeks, Dimitri replied, pulling a thick manila envelope from his briefcase. He slid it across the desk. It contained printed copies of the encrypted Project Nova files, the drafted Clause 4B, and the technical schematics of his rotor designs. "I don't want a divorce lawyer, however. I want a corporate executioner. I need to dismantle their trap without them noticing." Weber opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the documents with terrifying speed. He hummed a low, tuneless note, occasionally tapping a pen against his teeth. "They've built a very elegant snare," Weber murmured, tapping the draft of Clause 4B. "They are tying the core patents of your mechanical designs directly to the newly formed GmbH entity. Fiora, as co-founder, holds equal voting rights. The moment the Series A funds clear, they trigger a board vote citing operational differences, oust you from the executive role, and because your residency visa is tied to that specific role, you are deported. The company, the patents, and the money remain." "Can we fight it in court?" Dimitri asked, his jaw tight. "You could," Weber said, removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes. "And you would lose. You would be fighting Yusult's entire firm, draining the startup's capital, and likely losing your visa during the protracted litigation. No, we don't fight the trap, Mr. Volkov. We redefine the bait. Dmitri leaned forward. How? Weber pulled out a blank sheet of paper and began drawing a flowchart. Yusult is focusing on the macro-level corporate structure, the GmbH. She assumes the intellectual property you are assigning to the company is the totality of your invention. But you are an engineer. Is there a fundamental, microscopic component of your rotor design that the entire system relies upon? Something so small it might not be explicitly named in the broad patent filings she reviewed? Dmitri's mind raced through thousands of hours of CAD models and stress simulations. His eyes widened slowly. The harmonic dampening algorithm in the firmware. It's a proprietary sequence I wrote before we even moved to Berlin. It stabilizes the magnetic field. Without it, the physical rotors tear themselves apart at high RPMs. Weber smiled, a thin, wolfish grin. Is it currently licensed to the startup? No. Dmitri breathed, the realization dawning on him. It's intellectual property I developed entirely on my own, before the marriage, before the company existed. It's currently sitting on a private, encrypted drive. Perfect, Weber said, circling a box on his flowchart. We are going to quietly incorporate a holding company in a secondary jurisdiction, perhaps Estonia or Delaware. You will transfer the exclusive rights to that algorithm to the holding company. Then, you will draft a subtle licensing agreement, burying it deep within the technical appendices of the series' due diligence files. An agreement that stipulates the startup can only use the algorithm as long as you, Dmitri Volkov, are the active, controlling CEO. Dmitri stared at the diagram. It was a masterpiece of legal engineering. If they trigger Clause 4B and fire me, the licensing agreement instantly terminates. Weber finished, his voice a low rasp. The startup loses the legal right to use the algorithm. The hardware becomes useless metal. The venture capitalists will realize they bought a hollow shell, and the valuation drops to zero overnight. Fiora and Yusult will own a company that legally cannot operate. Dmitri sat back in the worn leather chair, the freezing rain outside completely forgotten. He looked at Weber, the weight of the last few weeks lifting, replaced by a cold, metallic resolve. Let's build it, Dmitri said. Weber picked up his pen. We have 3 weeks, Mr. Volkov. Let's make sure your wife and her lawyer sign their own death warrants. The polished oak table in Yusult's conference room felt as cold and unyielding as a butcher's block. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the pristine, minimalist space that overlooked the Spree River. Fiora sat to Dmitri's right, radiating a quiet, electric excitement that she carefully disguised as professional relief. Across from them sat Yusult, looking every inch the formidable architect of their future. She wore a tailored white blazer that sharply contrasted with the dark mahogany of her desk, her posture perfect, her expression a mask of serene competence. Between them lay the final stack of incorporation documents and the completed application for Dmitri's permanent residency visa. This is the culmination of a year's worth of navigating the Ausländerbehörde and the commercial registry, Yusult said, her voice smooth and practiced, resting her manicured hands on the thick stack of paper. The corporate structure for Volkov Dynamics GmbH is finalized. The Series A term sheets are attached as exhibits. And, most importantly, the founder visa application is complete. Fiora reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the documents. She looked at Dmitri, a soft, loving smile playing on her lips. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, a look so genuine it made Dmitri's stomach churn with physical nausea. We did it, Dima, Fiora whispered, her voice thick with manufactured emotion. All the late nights, the stress, it's finally paying off. Dmitri looked back at her, forcing the muscles in his face to form an expression of exhausted gratitude. He didn't look at Yusult. He knew if he met the lawyer's gaze, the sheer force of his suppressed rage might crack his facade. I couldn't have done it without you, Fiora, Dmitri said, his voice quiet, deliberately maintaining the persona of the weary, dependent engineer. Or you, Yusult. Thank you. Yusult offered a slight, acknowledging nod. It's my job, Dmitry. But I must say, Fiora's contribution to the UX design and the operational structuring was vital. The investors needed to see a balanced founding team. That's why we've solidified her position as co-founder with equal voting rights in the new GmbH structure. She tapped a specific page in the middle of the stack. Page 87. Dmitry didn't need to look at it to know what it said. It was the trap. Clause 4b. The legal mechanism that would allow them to sever him from his own company and his right to remain in Germany the moment the venture capital millions hit the bank account. It makes sense. Dmitry lied smoothly, leaning forward to pick up the heavy Montblanc pen Yusult had provided. Fiora is the face of the software. I'm just the guy in the lab. Fiora practically beamed, a subtle glance darting toward Yusult before returning to Dmitry. You're being modest, baby. But we make a good team. We do, Dmitry murmured, uncapping the pen. He looked down at the signature line. This was the moment of no return. Signing these documents meant officially walking into the snare Yusult had designed. It meant legally validating Fiora's equal claim to the company and accepting the poisoned terms of the visa application. But it also meant establishing the baseline reality that his counterplot, the hidden licensing agreement Weber was currently filing in Estonia, would soon obliterate. He took a slow, steady breath, channeling the cold precision of a machinist turning a lathe. He signed his name on the first page. Then the second. The scratch of the nib against the thick parchment was the only sound in the room. Fiora watched him, her eyes bright with a predatory anticipation that she thought was hidden behind her loving gaze. Yusult watched him with the clinical satisfaction of a hunter watching a trap snap shut. When Dmitry finished the final signature on the visa application, he pushed the stack back across the table. Done, he said, offering a tired smile. Yusult gathered the documents, tapping them against the desk to align the edges perfectly. Excellent. I will have these couriered to the registry and the immigration office this afternoon. The Series A signing with the investors is scheduled for next Friday. I suggest you both take this weekend to celebrate. You've earned it. Fiora stood up, leaning over to kiss Dmitry on the cheek. Her perfume, the expensive floral scent she wore for him, carefully layered over the faint, lingering trace of Yusult's sandalwood, filled his senses. Let's go to that Italian place in Kreuzberg tonight, Fiora suggested, her voice light and bubbly. Just the two of us. We have so much to celebrate. I'd love that, Dmitry said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. He turned to Yusult, finally meeting her cold, calculating eyes. Thank you again, Yusult, for everything you've done for us. My pleasure, Dmitry, Yusult replied, a subtle, chilling smile touching her lips. I look forward to finalizing the transaction next week. As Dmitry and Fiora walked out of the glass-walled office and into the sleek corridor, Fiora slipped her arm through his, leaning her head against his shoulder. She felt soft, warm, and entirely fake. Dmitry walked beside her, matching her pace, playing the role of the devoted, secure husband perfectly. He had just signed his life away on paper. But they didn't know that the paper they were holding was about to become worthless. The illusion of their security was complete, and now, Dmitry only had to wait for the final act. The neon glow of the startup incubator in Kreuzberg buzzed steadily, casting long, geometric shadows across the polished concrete floor. It was 4 a.m. on a Sunday. The open-plan office, usually a hive of manic energy, was deserted save for Dmitry, hunched over a workstation in the hardware testing bay. He wasn't working on the physical rotors tonight. He was working on the software bridge, the exact point where his mechanical genius met Fiora's sleek, intuitive UX design. Fiora was brilliant at making complex data look beautiful and effortless to the user. But her interface needed to talk to his machines, and that conversation was governed by thousands of lines of integration code. Code that Dmitry had originally written to be robust, open, and easily handed off to a future engineering team. That was before he knew his wife and his lawyer were planning to fire him and take the company. Dmitry pulled up the main repository for the Volkov Dynamics control software. The cursor blinked rhythmically, a tiny, impatient pulse in the quiet room. He began to systematically dismantle the clean architecture he had spent months building. He wasn't breaking the code. He was obfuscating it. He introduced a series of complex, mathematically redundant subroutines into the data stream that fed Fiora's dashboard. To an outside observer, even a skilled auditor hired by the venture capitalists, the software would function perfectly during the upcoming due diligence demonstrations. The rotors would spin, the data would flow, and Fiora's interface would display the metrics flawlessly. But beneath the surface, Dmitry was tying the entire system into a Gordian knot that only he could untangle. He created hard-coded dependencies linking the core hardware drivers to his specific biometric login and a unique set of cryptographic keys stored only on his personal, encrypted servers. He altered the error handling protocols so that if anyone attempted to bypass his credentials or restructure the administrative hierarchy, as Fiora and Uselt planned to do under Clause 4b, the software wouldn't just crash. It would initiate a cascading failure, wiping the calibration data on the magnetic rotors and rendering the hardware useless. It was a breathtaking piece of digital sabotage. He was turning his life's work into a hostage situation. Dmitry typed steadily, his face illuminated by the blue light of the monitors. The physical exhaustion of the past weeks was replaced by a cold, adrenaline-fueled focus. Every line of code he rewrote was a silent scream of betrayal, translated into syntax and logic. He thought of Fiora, currently asleep in their apartment, likely dreaming of the millions she was about to secure. He thought of the way she had smiled at Uselt in the conference room, the shared, predatory triumph in their eyes. The memory fueled his keystrokes, making them sharper, more precise. By 6:30 a.m., the first pale light of dawn began to bleed through the industrial windows. Dmitry ran a final compilation check. The system booted perfectly. The integration with Fiora's UX was seamless. The trap was set, invisible and lethal. He pushed back from the desk, rubbing his burning eyes. He had successfully weaponized the product. When Fiora and Uselt sprang their legal trap and ousted him, the company they stole would instantly become a multi-million euro paperweight. The venture capitalists would demand answers, and the only person capable of providing them, the only person who could make the machine work, would be the man they just fired. Dmitry stood up, stretching his stiff back. He grabbed his coat and walked out into the freezing Berlin morning. The city was quiet, the air sharp and clean. He walked toward the U-Bahn station, the weight of the sabotage sitting heavy but necessary in his chest. He had built the mechanical trap with Weber in Estonia, and now he had built the digital trap in the code. Fiora and Uselt thought they were playing a game of corporate chess, moving pieces on a board of their own design. They didn't realize Dmitry had already rigged the board to explode. He boarded the train back to Kreuzberg, preparing to walk through his front door and play the role of the loving, exhausted husband for 5 more days. 5 days until the signing. 5 days until the execution. The air in the boardroom of the venture capital firm off Kurfürstendamm was dry, smelling faintly of ozone and expensive espresso. It was Tuesday, 3 days before the final signing. The long, scarred mahogany table was cluttered with laptops, empty water glasses, and the massive, spiraled binders of the series a due diligence report. Dmitry sat at one end, the physical embodiment of a brilliant, exhausted founder. Fiora sat to his right, radiant and articulate, walking the lead investor, a sharp-eyed Bavarian named Kessler, through the user retention metrics. Uselt anchored the far end of the table, an immaculate shark in a charcoal suit, her legal team arrayed behind her like pilot fish. The proprietary interface Fiora has designed is, frankly, the most intuitive dashboard I've seen in the industrial hardware space, Kessler noted, tapping his Montblanc pen against a financial projection. He turned his gaze to Dmitry. And the magnetic rotor stability is unprecedented. But, Mr. Volkov, your cap table and operational structure are highly concentrated. We are investing in the synergy between your engineering and your wife's design. We need assurances that this synergy is legally bulletproof. This was the moment. The pivot point Uselt had engineered. Uselt leaned forward smoothly, sliding a sleek gray folder across the table to Kessler. If you review Addendum C of the operating agreement, per Kessler, you will see we have structured the GmbH to address exactly that concern. Fiora holds equal voting rights and, under Clause 4b, retains executive control of the IP in the event of any unforeseen operational dissolution. It ensures the company continues seamlessly, protecting your investment regardless of individual founder circumstances. Kessler scanned the clause, his brow furrowing slightly. It's aggressive protection for the co-founder, unusually strong for a UX lead over the primary engineer. It reflects the reality of the modern tech landscape. Yusult countered, her voice a calm, authoritative stream over jagged rocks. Hardware is useless without user adoption. Fiora's architecture is the bridge to the market. Dimitri, she turned her dark, predatory eyes on him, a subtle challenge in her stare, agrees completely that this structure is best for the long-term health of Volkov Dynamics. Dimitri felt Fiora's hand slip beneath the table, resting on his knee. A gentle, reassuring squeeze. The physical touch made his skin crawl, a visceral reaction he had to force down into his stomach. He looked at Kessler, maintaining the weary, agreeable mask he had perfected over the last 3 weeks. "I'm an engineer, per Kessler," Dimitri said, his voice carrying the perfect pitch of a man out of his depth in a boardroom. "I trust my wife's vision for the company, and I trust Yusult's legal expertise. If they say this structure secures the funding and the visas, then it's the right structure. My focus is entirely on scaling the production of the rotors." Fiora beamed at him, a look of such profound, manufactured adoration that Dimitri almost admired the sheer sociopathy of it. "Dima is the genius," she told Kessler softly. "I just make sure the world can understand him." Kessler nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied by the domestic harmony and the legal ironclad. "Very well. If the founders are aligned, we proceed. The final signing is scheduled for Friday at 10 a.m. in our Frankfurt office. I expect all documents, including the final visa sponsorships, to be executed simultaneously." "They will be," Yusult assured him, standing up and buttoning her jacket. "The structural trap is set, per Kessler." She hadn't actually said trap, but Dimitri heard it in the smug, razor-thin smile she aimed at Fiora as they packed their briefcases. They had done it. They had hustled the investors and legally positioned Dimitri for slaughter. Later that evening, the Kreuzberg apartment was suffocatingly quiet. The adrenaline of the boardroom had drained away, leaving Dimitri feeling hollowed out. Fiora was in the bedroom, ostensibly packing for the trip to Frankfurt, but her phone had chimed twice with the distinct, encrypted notification tone she used for Yusult. Dimitri stood by the kitchen window, staring out at the rain-slicked streets. He had survived the due diligence. He had watched Yusult lay the snare right in front of him and had willingly stepped into it. The physical toll of the deception was immense. His shoulders ached, and his jaw was tight from constantly grinding his teeth. Fiora padded into the kitchen wearing his favorite t-shirt, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. 3 more days, Dima, she whispered, kissing the space between his shoulder blades. 3 more days, and the pressure is gone. We'll be rich, we'll be legal residents, and we can finally just breathe. Yeah, Dimitri rasped, staring at his own reflection in the dark glass. He placed his hands over hers, feeling the cold metal of her wedding ring. 3 more days, Fiora. Then everything changes. She squeezed him tighter, oblivious to the truth echoing in his words. The Berlin hustle was over. The execution was scheduled, and Dimitri was ready to pull the lever. The low hum of the dehumidifier in their Kreuzberg apartment usually put Dimitri to sleep, but tonight, it sounded like a countdown timer. It was 1 a.m. on Thursday, 33 hours before the signing in Frankfurt. Dimitri lay motionless in the dark, staring at the ceiling, pretending to be asleep. Fiora was sitting up next to him, the harsh, white glow of her iPad illuminating her profile. She was meticulously reviewing the final, compiled PDF of the series A Due Diligence Report, a document spanning over 400 pages of legal and technical jargon. Normally, She would only skim the sections Uselt had drafted, focusing on the UI/UX integration and the cap table. But tonight, perhaps driven by the anxious energy of an impending million-euro grift, she was reading the technical appendices. Dmitri watched her from beneath half-closed eyelids. He saw the exact moment her brow furrowed. Her fingers stopped scrolling, tapping rhythmically against the edge of the tablet. "Dima," Fiora whispered, her voice tight, a sharp contrast to the soft, loving tone she usually adopted when she thought he was asleep. He didn't move, regulating his breathing to mimic deep slumber. He needed to know what she had found before he reacted. She nudged his shoulder, harder this time. "Dmitri, wake up." He groaned softly, shifting his weight, and opened his eyes, squinting against the glare of the screen. "Fiora? What time is it? What's wrong?" "I was just looking over the final IP schedules," she said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent murmur. She turned the iPad toward him, pointing a manicured nail at a dense block of text buried in Appendix H. Uselt explicitly listed all the patents for the magnetic rotor casings and the stator assemblies under the GmbH ownership. But there's a footnote here about the firmware, a harmonic dampening sequence. It says the source code is currently held in escrow. Dmitri felt a cold spike of adrenaline pierce his chest. It was the thread. The single, microscopic thread Weber had left in the document to ensure the venture capitalists technically had full disclosure, while relying on Uselt's arrogance to gloss over it. "The harmonic what?" Dmitri asked, rubbing his eyes, injecting his voice with the groggy irritation of an overworked engineer. "Fiora, it's 1 a.m. "The harmonic dampening sequence," Fiora repeated, her eyes narrowing slightly, searching his face. The UX designer in her was looking for anomalies in his micro-expressions. "I thought everything, all the software and hardware, was being transferred to the Volkov Dynamics entity. Why is this specific piece of code in escrow? Uselt didn't mention this." Dmitri forced a tired sigh, sitting up and leaning against the headboard. He ran a hand through his hair, projecting exhaustion rather than panic. This was the most dangerous conversation he had navigated in weeks. "It's just an old, pre-incorporation stability patch," Dmitri lied, his voice flat, devoid of the defensive edge that would trigger her suspicion. "I wrote it years ago, before we even met, to keep early prototypes from shaking themselves apart. The investors wanted it documented for the tech audit, but it's essentially obsolete now. The new rotor designs handle the harmonics physically, not digitally." Fiora stared at the screen, her lips pursed. She was intelligent, calculating, and deeply paranoid by nature, traits that made her an excellent liar, but also made her hyper-aware of being lied to. "If it's obsolete, why is it listed as a dependency for the main control interface?" she pressed, her voice cooling. "Should I call Uselt? We can't have any IP ambiguities this close to the signing." Dmitri's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, mechanical rhythm. If she called Uselt now, the lawyer would tear the footnote apart. She would find the Estonian holding company. She would see the kill switch Dmitri had built into the licensing agreement. The entire counterplot would detonate prematurely. He reached out, placing his hand over hers on the iPad, gently pushing the screen down. He looked at her, his eyes soft, channeling the absolute, pathetic devotion of the man she thought she was manipulating. "Fiora, please," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly with perfectly feigned stress. "I'm so tired. I've spent the last 6 months fighting with these machines so we can have this life. The code is documented so the auditors don't think we're hiding legacy software. Uselt already reviewed the main patent transfers. If we wake her up at 1 a.m. over an obsolete footnote, she's going to think we're panicking and the investors might spook." He let his thumb brush over her knuckles. "Trust me, I built the machine. It works. The company is ours." Fiora looked at him, the harsh light of the screen fading as the tablet went to sleep. She studied his face, the dark circles under his eyes, the tense set of his jaw. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. Slowly, the tension drained from her posture. The predatory suspicion in her eyes was replaced by the familiar, condescending warmth. She believed him. She believed he was too exhausted, too in love, and too fundamentally simple to deceive her. "Okay, baby," Fiora murmured, leaning in to kiss his forehead. "You're right. I'm just overthinking it. The pressure is getting to me too." She set the iPad on the nightstand and slid back under the covers, turning away from him. Dmitri lay back down, staring at the ceiling in the dark. He had survived the fracture. The trap was still intact. He closed his eyes, listening to her breathing slow into rhythm. "You wanted the company, Fiora," he thought, the cold resolve hardening into something dark and absolute. "You can have the shell, but the soul of the machine is mine." The high-speed ice train to Frankfurt was a silent bullet cutting through the dark, snow-dusted German countryside. It was Thursday evening. The first-class cabin was nearly empty, the air smelling of stale coffee and anticipation. Dmitri and Fiora sat across from each other in the plush leather seats, the small table between them cluttered with the final printed itineraries and their passports. Fiora was practically glowing. The stress that usually tightened the corners of her eyes was gone, replaced by a serene, electric confidence. She looked out the window at the blurred lights of passing towns, a soft, triumphant smile playing on her lips. She was 24 hours away from securing everything: the venture capital, the company, the visa, and eventually, Uselt. Dmitri watched her reflection in the dark glass. For a fleeting, agonizing moment, he saw the woman he had met 3 years ago in a noisy cafe in Mitte. The brilliant, passionate UX designer who had listened to his chaotic ideas about magnetic propulsion and sketched a beautiful interface on a napkin. The woman who had promised to build a life with him in a foreign country. That woman was dead. The person sitting across from him was a stranger wearing her skin, a parasite that had fed on his genius and was now preparing to discard the host. "We did it, Dima," Fiora said softly, turning away from the window to look at him. She reached across the table, lacing her fingers through his. Her touch was warm, familiar, and utterly toxic. "Tomorrow at this time, we'll be celebrating in the investors' lounge. Millions in the bank. Our residency secured." She squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with manufactured devotion. "I know this year has been incredibly hard on you. The late nights, the stress, the paranoia. But I told you we were building something real, something that would last." Dmitri looked down at their joined hands. He felt the smooth, cold band of his wedding ring pressing against his skin. It felt like a handcuff. He didn't pull away. He let the silence stretch, absorbing the sheer scale of her deception. She was so confident in her victory, so certain of his blindness, that she could sit there and use the word paranoia to his face. "It has been hard," Dmitri finally said, his voice quiet, stripped of the feigned exhaustion he had been projecting for weeks. He looked up, meeting her gaze steadily. The mask he had worn since discovering the hidden server was beginning to slip, not out of carelessness, but out of a profound, cold clarity. "But you're right, Fiora. We are building exactly what we deserve." Fiora tilted her head slightly, a microscopic flicker of confusion crossing her perfect features. There was something in his tone, a flat, unreadable detachment, that didn't align with the grateful, dependent husband she expected. But the arrogance of her impending success quickly smoothed it over. "We are," she agreed, smiling softly. She leaned back in her seat, picking up her phone. The screen illuminated her face. A message notification popped up. Dmitri didn't need to see the screen to know it was Uselt, likely confirming the final ambush protocols for tomorrow's meeting. Dmitri turned his attention back to the window, watching the darkness rush past. He wasn't mourning the loss of the company. He had already engineered its retrieval. He was mourning the death of his own innocence. The engineer who had believed that logic, hard work, and love were enough to build a stable foundation. He realized now that some structures were fundamentally flawed from the beginning. No amount of reinforcement could save them. They had to be demolished to the ground. As the train began its descent into the sprawling, illuminated grid of Frankfurt, Fiora tucked her phone away and reached for her coat. "Ready?" she asked, her voice bright with anticipation. Dmitri stood up, adjusting his suit jacket. He looked at his wife one last time, committing the image of her triumphant smile to memory. He needed to remember this exact face tomorrow, when he stripped it all away. "I've never been more ready," Dmitri said. They walked off the train together, stepping into the freezing night air. Fiora hailed a taxi to their hotel, her arm linked tightly through his. She thought she was leading him to the slaughter. She had no idea she was holding the hand of her own executioner. The boardroom of Kessler and Partners in Frankfurt was a cavern of glass and steel, suspended 50 stories above the city. The Friday morning sun glared off the polished mahogany table, illuminating the neat stacks of final incorporation documents, wire transfer authorizations, and the visa sponsorship forms. Dmitri sat precisely where he was expected to sit, across from the lead investor, Kessler, with Fiora to his right and Yusult flanking them. Fiora wore a crisp, white silk blouse, radiating the composed energy of a newly minted tech millionaire. Yusult was clad in a severe black suit, her predatory eyes scanning the documents with the satisfaction of a master architect admiring her completed fortress. "Gentlemen and ladies," Kessler began, steepling his fingers over the thick Series A binders. "The 15 million euro wire transfer is queued. The Auslander board has pre-approved the permanent residency applications based on these finalized operating agreements. All that remains are the signatures on the GmbH formation and the IP assignments." Yusult leaned forward smoothly, sliding a silver pin across the table toward Kessler. "The structure is sound, Herr Kessler. As we discussed, Volkov Dynamics GmbH will hold all core patents. Fiora and Dmitri are equal voting partners, with Fiora assuming executive control of the IP under Clause 4B in the event of founder dissolution. This guarantees your investment against personal instability." Fiora smiled at Kessler, a perfect picture of professional reassurance, before turning that same smile on Dmitri. It was the same look she had given him in the kitchen when she told him he was imagining things. Dmitri didn't smile back. He didn't pick up his pen. The time for playing the exhausted, trusting fool was over. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair, the leather creaking loudly in the silent, expectant room. He looked at Kessler, his gaze steady and cold. "There is a slight inaccuracy in Yusult's assessment of the intellectual property, Herr Kessler." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Fiora's smile froze, a microscopic twitch of confusion crossing her face. Yusult's eyes narrowed instantly, snapping toward Dmitri like a coiled snake sensing a vibration. "Excuse me," Yusult said, her voice a low, warning hiss. "The IP schedules were finalized during due diligence, Dmitri. You signed off on them." "I signed off on the hardware patents," Dmitri corrected softly, reaching into his briefcase. He pulled out a single, thin gray folder, not the massive binders Yusult had prepared, and slid it across the mahogany table to Kessler. "What Yusult failed to disclose to you, and what my wife failed to understand when she tried to steal my company, is that the hardware is functionally useless without the firmware." Fiora gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. The blood drained from her face as the words "steal my company" echoed off the glass walls. Yusult slammed her hands on the table, abandoning her polished veneer. "What is this?" Yusult demanded, her voice sharp with sudden, raw panic. She reached for the gray folder, but Kessler smoothly placed his hand over it, his eyes fixed on Dmitri with sudden, intense interest. "This," Dmitri said, his voice ringing with the calm precision of a man who had spent months engineering an explosion, "is a certified licensing agreement. It proves that the harmonic dampening algorithm, the core software that keeps the magnetic rotors from tearing themselves apart, is not owned by Volkov Dynamics GmbH." Kessler opened the folder, his eyes scanning the document rapidly. "It is owned by an holding company I incorporated in Estonia 3 weeks ago," Dmitri continued, his gaze shifting to Fiora, watching the horror bloom in her eyes as she realized the depth of his knowledge. "The algorithm is licensed to the startup strictly on the condition that I remain the sole, controlling CEO. If Clause 4B is triggered, if Fiora and Yusult attempt to oust me, the license terminates instantly." He turned his cold, mechanical stare back to Yusult, who was now visibly shaking with rage and disbelief. If you fire me, Yusult, you and Fiora will own 15 million euros worth of useless metal that legally cannot be turned on. The valuation of Volkov Dynamics drops to zero. Today, Kessler looked up from the document, his sharp Bavarian eyes calculating the carnage. He didn't look angry. He looked impressed. He closed the gray folder and tapped it thoughtfully. Is this accurate, Frau von Berg? Did you draft an operating agreement that leaves the core functional IP outside the company's control? Yusult opened her mouth, her legal mind racing for a loophole, a defense, anything to salvage the trap she had spent months building. But there was nothing. Dmitri had bypassed her macrostructure entirely and crippled the foundation. I was unaware of the Estonian entity. Yusult stammered, the absolute humiliation of being outmaneuvered by an engineer choking her words. Because you were too busy sleeping with my wife to do your job properly, Dmitri stated flatly, the silence that followed ringing in his ears. Fiora let out a choked sob, shrinking back into her chair, her perfectly constructed world collapsing around her. The ambush was complete. The trap was sprung, and Dmitri was the only one left standing. The silence in the Frankfurt boardroom was absolute, broken only by the ragged, panicked breathing of Fiora. She sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Yusult, the formidable architect of their destruction, looked as though she had been struck by lightning. Her pristine professional mask had shattered, leaving behind a pale, terrified reality. Kessler leaned back slowly in his chair, his sharp eyes moving from the trembling lawyer to the weeping wife, and finally settling on the cold, motionless engineer. He didn't offer sympathy. He dealt in leverage and risk assessment. This is an extraordinary development, Herr Volkov, Kessler said, his voice a low rumble in the cavernous room. You have essentially built a dead man's switch into your own company. A highly irregular, albeit brilliantly effective, countermeasure to a hostile takeover. He paused, tapping his pen against the Estonian licensing agreement. However, my firm cannot invest 15 million euros into a company where the founders are engaged in a corporate civil war, nor can we proceed with a cap table built on fraud. There won't be a civil war, Herr Kessler, Dmitri replied, his voice flat and devoid of the adrenaline that usually accompanied revenge. It was the sound of a man closing a ledger. Because there won't be a co-founder. Fiora let out a choked sob, her eyes wide and pleading as she reached out across the table toward him. Dima, please. Dima, you're angry. I understand. We can fix this. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Dmitri didn't look at her. He kept his gaze locked on Kessler. He reached into his briefcase one final time and produced a second, thinner folder. He slid it precisely to the center of the table. This is a formal complaint I filed with the German Bar Association at 8 o'clock this morning, Dmitri stated, the words dropping like stones into still water. It details how Yusult von Berg, acting as legal counsel for Volkov Dynamics, knowingly drafted fraudulent operating agreements designed to misappropriate intellectual property and manipulate immigration sponsorship for her personal, romantic partner. Yusult flinched violently, a short, sharp gasp escaping her lips. You have no proof of that. A personal relationship does not invalidate a legal structure. She tried to summon her commanding tone, but it cracked, sounding thin and desperate. I have the decrypted logs from the private server you used to orchestrate the takeover with my wife, Dmitri countered smoothly, turning his deadened eyes to the lawyer. I have the timestamps of your communications, cross-referenced with the drafting of Clause 4B. I have the photographs you took in the Black Forest while Fiora told me she was working late to secure our visas. It's all in the filing. Yusult slumped back in her chair, the fight draining out of her instantly. She knew the mechanics of her profession better than anyone. The Bar Association would not just investigate, they would eviscerate her. The scandal would destroy her firm, and the fraud charges could lead to disbarment and criminal prosecution. She was finished. As for the visas, Dmitri continued, turning his attention to the stack of immigration paperwork that was supposed to secure their future in Berlin. He picked up the application bearing Fiora's name as co-founder. Because Fiora is being removed from Volkov Dynamics effective immediately for breach of fiduciary duty and corporate espionage, this sponsorship is void. He looked directly at his wife, the UX designer who had painted a beautiful interface over a rotten core. She was sobbing openly now, the reality of her total defeat crashing down on her. "You used my startup to get a visa, Fiora," Dmitry said softly, the coldness in his voice finally giving way to a profound, exhausted sadness. "And you used Uselt to steal it. But you built your entire plan on the assumption that I was too stupid, too trusting, and too blind to see the wiring." He took a slow breath, the air in the room feeling lighter, cleaner. "Kessler," Dmitry said, turning back to the investor, "I will restructure the cap table by Monday. I retain 100% of the voting shares and the IP through the Estonian holding company. Fiora is out. Uselt is fired. If those terms are acceptable, we proceed with the funding. If not, I take my technology to a firm that appreciates operational security." Kessler looked at the wreckage of the two women across the table, then at Dmitry. He offered a slow, grim nod. "Monday morning, Herr Volkov. Have the clean paperwork on my desk." Dmitry stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He didn't pack his briefcase. He left the folders on the table as a monument to their ruin. He had disassembled their trap, piece by piece, and crushed them with the sheer weight of his countermeasure. He walked toward the glass doors, the sound of Fiora weeping echoing behind him. The hallway outside the Kessler and Partners boardroom was lined with pale, veined marble, cold and reflective as a frozen lake. Dmitry walked down the corridor, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind him, cutting off the sound of Uselt's panicked, hushed voice and Fiora's ragged weeping. He didn't run. He walked with the slow, measured pace of a man who had just dismantled a bomb and was finally stepping out of the blast radius. His hands, which had been perfectly steady while presenting the Estonian kill switch, now trembled slightly with the massive adrenaline dump. "Dima, Dmitry, wait." The frantic click of heels echoed sharply against the marble. Fiora burst through the boardroom doors, her face streaked with mascara, the pristine image of the successful co-founder shattered into desperate, ugly pieces. She practically threw herself at him, her hands clawing at his suit jacket. "Please," Fiora gasped, her voice raw, stripped of the melodic, condescending tone she had used for months. "Please, Dima, don't do this. I'm sorry. I was stupid. I was scared. Uselt, she convinced me the investors needed security." Dmitry stopped. He didn't push her away, but he didn't hold her either. He looked down at the woman he had loved, the woman he had moved across an ocean for, the woman who had looked into his eyes and told him he was losing his mind while she planned to steal his life's work. "Stop lying, Fiora," Dmitry said, his voice terrifyingly quiet, devoid of the anger she expected. It was the sound of a hollowed-out machine. "You weren't scared. You were arrogant. You thought I was just a mechanism you could use to generate wealth and residency, and then discard when I was no longer useful." "No," Fiora sobbed, burying her face in his chest, her tears soaking his shirt. "I love you. I do. It was a mistake. We can fix this. You have the company now. We don't need Uselt. I'll sign whatever you want. Just don't pull my visa sponsorship. Please, Dima. They'll deport me. I have nothing here without you." Dmitry reached up, his hands slow and deliberate. He grasped her wrists, feeling the delicate bones beneath her skin, and gently, inexorably, peeled her hands off his jacket. He took a step back, putting a physical distance between them that mirrored the cavernous void in his chest. He looked at her tear-streaked face, remembering the night in their Kreuzberg apartment when she had stroked his cheek, smelling of Uselt's perfume, and gaslit him into believing he was mentally unstable. He had spent months living in that psychological torture chamber she had built, smiling while he swallowed poison. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He unlocked it and brought up the digital partition he had hidden from her. He selected the entire folder labeled Berlin_UI_assets_2024. The photos of her and Yusult, the drafted coup documents, the proof of her betrayal. He tapped delete. Then he confirmed it. Fiora watched him, her eyes wide, a flicker of desperate hope igniting in the chaos of her panic. She thought he was destroying the evidence. She thought he was forgiving her. "I'm not sending it to the police," Dmitri said softly, putting the phone back in his pocket. "The Bar Association has all they need to ruin Yusult. And Kessler has all he needs to remove you. The rest of it, it's just noise now." He reached for his left hand. Slowly, methodically, he twisted the plain gold wedding band off his ring finger. The metal felt heavy, a physical manifestation of a contract that had been breached long ago. He held it out to her. Fiora stared at the ring, the hope in her eyes dying instantly, replaced by absolute, horrifying clarity. She finally understood. He hadn't just beaten her in the boardroom. He had excised her from his reality completely. Dmitri didn't drop the ring into her hand. He turned and placed it gently on a small, decorative marble pedestal next to a potted fern in the hallway. A meaningless resting place for a meaningless symbol. He looked back at her one last time. She was weeping silently now, a broken, empty shell standing in a corporate hallway in Frankfurt, thousands of miles from the life she thought she had secured. "You wanted the visa, Fiora," Dmitri said, his voice echoing softly against the cold stone, the final, devastating truth of his revenge. "You can keep it. But the company? The company was always mine." He turned and walked toward the elevators. He didn't look back as the silver doors slid open. He stepped inside, pressing the button for the lobby. He had secured his millions. He had secured his residency. He had protected his life's work. As the elevator descended, plunging him back into the freezing reality of the city, Dmitri stared at his reflection in the polished metal doors. He had won everything, and he had never felt so utterly, terrifyingly alone.